The storm hit Caldwell, Kansas like a fist from God, and Edith Ford arrived in the middle of it with nothing but a carpetbag, a bruised heart, and the particular kind of terror that only comes to a woman who has buried one life and does not yet know if she deserves another. She had been on the road for 3 days by the time the rain turned the main street of Caldwell into a river of red mud. The year was 1879, and the cattle trails were still humming with dust and commerce, the town swollen with drovers and merchants and gamblers who had followed the money north from Texas. Edith did not belong among any of them. She was 26 years old, recently widowed from a man named Gerald Ford who had left her a small debt, a smaller reputation, and absolutely nothing else of consequence. Gerald had died of a fever in Wichita in the early days of September, and Edith had spent the weeks following his death discovering, one humiliating revelation at a time, just how little he had provided for her. The debts had arrived first, then the creditors. Then the men Gerald had borrowed from, who were not the kind of men who waited politely for repayment. Edith had packed what she could carry, sold what she could not, and climbed aboard a westbound stage with the vague and terrified idea that distance was the closest thing to safety she could afford. She stood now beneath the narrow overhang of a general store that had already closed for the evening, watching the rain sheet across the street in silver curtains, her carpetbag clutched against her chest, her hat drooping with water. She had exactly $4.30 in her coat pocket. The hotel at the end of the street had a lamp burning in the window, but she had already done the arithmetic and knew that even the cheapest room would eat through half of what she had, and she still needed to eat. She was trying very hard not to cry when the door of the feed store across the street swung open, and a man stepped out into the rain as though it were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall and broad-shouldered in a long canvas duster that the rain had darkened at the shoulders. He wore his hat low and moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made peace with weather a long time ago. He was carrying a 50-pound sack of grain over one shoulder as though it weighed nothing at all, and he loaded it into the back of a wagon with practiced ease before turning and noticing her. He stopped. Edith straightened her spine because it was the only thing left she could do with dignity. He crossed the street toward her through the mud and the rain without hesitating, and she saw his face clearly when he stepped beneath the overhang. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where the rain had reached it, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something durable, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, somewhere between brown and gold and gray, changing as the lamplight caught them. There was a scar along his left jaw, old and pale, and he had the kind of hands that told a whole story without words, large and weathered and capable. He did not look at her, the way the men in the streets of Wichita had looked at her after Gerald died. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who is clearly in trouble and is deciding what the decent thing to do might be. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and unhurried, with a slight southern undertone that had been mostly weathered away by years of open sky. "You appear to be in need of somewhere to be." Edith blinked. It was such a precise and honest assessment of her situation that it startled a small, involuntary sound from her that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "I appear to be," she agreed, because she was too tired to pretend otherwise. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles east," he said. "It's nothing impressive, but it's dry. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alma Greer, keeps a spare room. She's a decent woman and she's been there 15 years, so you wouldn't be without chaperone if that's a concern to you." Edith stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed, and he did not seem troubled by this at all. "But you're standing in a rainstorm with a carpetbag and an expression I recognize. I've seen it on people who have run out of good options. I'm Nelson Sheridan. I own the S ranch east of town. You're welcome to shelter until the weather breaks and you've had a chance to figure out your next move." "How long?" Edith asked, because the offer was extraordinary and she needed to understand its edges. "However long you need," he said simply. "A week if that's enough." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain roared on the overhang above them. Somewhere down the street, a horse protested the weather from inside a livery. She thought about the $4.30 in her pocket and the men in Wichita who had Gerald's debts in their ledgers and her name written below his, and she made the only reasonable decision she had left. "My name is Edith Ford," she said, "and I would be grateful for a week." Nelson Sheridan nodded as though the matter were settled, which apparently it was. "Wagons across the street," he said, "if you don't mind the rain for 30 seconds. She did not mind it. She had been minding it for 3 days, and one more crossing was nothing. The ranch was exactly as he had described it, nothing impressive, but the word he had chosen was wrong. It was not impressive in the way that a grand house is impressive, with ornamentation and scale meant to intimidate. But it was solid and square and looked like it had been built by someone who intended to stay, which in 1879 Kansas was a kind of impressiveness all its own. There were 2 barns and a corral with a dozen horses moving softly in the dark and wet, and the house itself was whitewashed timber with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and there were curtains in the windows that someone had put there with care. Mrs. Alma Greer met them at the door with a lamp and an expression of complete unsurprisability. She was a small, round woman somewhere in her 60s, with iron-gray hair pinned severely and eyes that were sharp and warm in equal measure. She looked Edith up and down with professional assessment and said, "You're soaked through. Come in. I'll heat water." And that was how Edith Ford came to be standing in the kitchen of Nelson Sheridan's ranch, dripping onto a clean plank floor, while Mrs. Greer put a kettle on, and Nelson disappeared to deal with the wagon and the horses as though delivering storm-drenched strangers to his home was a perfectly ordinary Thursday evening. Edith slept that first night in a small room off the kitchen hallway that had a quilt on the bed and a rag rug on the floor, and a single window that looked east toward a darkness that slowly turned to pale prairie as the rain stopped before dawn. She lay awake for a long time listening to the sounds of the house settling, and she thought about what she had done and where she was, and she felt, under the fear and the grief and the exhaustion, the smallest and most fragile thing, the first stirring of something that might, if she were very careful with it, become hope. She was up before Mrs. Greer the next morning, which seemed to surprise and please the older woman when she came into the kitchen to find Edith already at the stove with coffee started and bread dough that she had found and shaped into loaves on the board. "Gerald never let me be idle," Edith said, which was the most neutral way she could describe a marriage that had required her to be useful at all times. "I'm better when I have something to do with my hands." "So am I," Mrs. Greer said approvingly and poured herself a cup of the coffee. "Mr. Sheridan takes breakfast at 6. He'll have eggs if there are eggs, which there are, and he'll be grateful for whatever else there is, which is how I know he was raised properly." "Did you know his family?" Edith asked because she was curious and because she found that asking about people was safer than talking about herself. "Knew his mother," Mrs. Greer said. "Good woman. Died of typhoid when Nelson was 17. Father followed her 2 years later, which is when Nelson came out here and started building this place. He was 19 years old and he built the first barn with his own 2 hands, and then he just kept going." Edith absorbed this as she tended the eggs. A young man of 19 building a barn alone on the Kansas prairie. She could picture it more clearly than she wanted to, and the picture made something ache in a part of her chest she had thought was already too battered to feel new things. Nelson came to breakfast at 6 exactly, which told her he was a man of discipline and routine, and he ate what she had made with genuine gratitude and without comment about who had made it. He said good morning to her with the same unhurried courtesy he had offered the night before, poured his own coffee, asked Mrs. Greer about a fence repair near the north pasture, and then excused himself to go work. He did not ask Edith about her plans or her past or her business. He treated her presence in his kitchen as though it were entirely natural. She spent the first 3 days like that, learning the rhythms of the ranch, helping Mrs. greer in the ways she could, staying small and quiet and out of the way of the men who worked the cattle. There were 4 ranch hands, all of them polite and none of them intrusive, and they moved through the days with the physical poetry of men who had been doing hard outdoor work long enough that it had become beautiful. On the 4th day, Nelson was fixing a broken hinge on the corral gate when Edith walked past with a basket of laundry, and he looked up and said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I want to." He looked at her for a moment with those Creekwater eyes that were difficult to read and said, "You're not a hired hand, Mrs. Ford." "No," she agreed. "But I'm not a guest who sits either. It isn't in my nature." There was a pause while he considered this, and then something in his expression shifted, not a smile exactly, but the suggestion of one, something warming at the corners. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to the hinge. It was the 5th day when things changed, which is always how it is, the 5th or 6th day when the routine has been established long enough to have weight, when the people in it have started to become real to each other. Edith was in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds from between the rows of late autumn vegetables that still had some fight left in them, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Fast hoofbeats. She straightened and shaded her eyes and felt the fear move through her like cold water before she even consciously identified it, because her body remembered that fast hoofbeats on an open road had not historically been good news. 2 riders came through the gate without stopping, which no one was supposed to do without an invitation. Nelson appeared from the direction of the barn at the sound of them, and Edith saw his hand go briefly to his hip. He wore a revolver there, a Colt, and she had noticed it without remarking on it because every man in Kansas wore iron, before he let it fall again as he assessed the situation. The riders were young, maybe 20 and 22, and they had the particular reckless energy of men who had been drinking since morning. They stopped their horses in the yard, and the taller one looked down at Nelson and said something that Edith could not hear from where she stood. Whatever it was, Nelson answered it shortly, and with a flatness that was not unfriendly but was absolutely final. The shorter rider said something else and gestured toward the house, and that was when Nelson's posture changed in a way that was visible from 50 feet away. He said something. The riders looked at each other and then they left. No argument, no escalation. They simply turned their horses and rode back out the gate, and Nelson watched them go with absolute stillness until they were gone from sight. When he turned back toward the barn, he glanced at the garden and saw Edith standing there, and their eyes met across the distance. He walked toward her, unhurried as always. "Friends of yours?" she asked, because she needed to fill the silence and because the fear had not entirely left her yet. "Trail hands from the Holcomb spread," he said. "Heard there was a woman staying here, wanted to know if she needed company." Something cold settled in Edith's stomach. She said nothing. "I told them the woman in question was none of their concern," Nelson said, "and that they were welcome to keep riding." He paused. "They'll keep riding." "How do you know?" she asked. He looked at her with that direct, quiet regard. "Because I told them to." There was no boast in it, no posturing, just a simple statement of cause and effect, and Edith believed him in a way she had not believed a man in a very long time. Gerald Ford had made many statements about what he would and would not do, and very few of them had been accurate. This man said a thing, and it was as solid as the barn he had built with his own hands at 19. "Thank you," she said. "No need," he replied and went back to work. That night, for the first time since Gerald had died, Edith did not cry before she slept. On the 6th evening, the week nearly done, she found herself dreading what came next in a way that surprised her. She had been trying not to think about it, about leaving, about where she would go, about the $4 and some change and the open unknown of the westward road. But the days on this ranch had been the first quiet she had known in months, and quiet, she was learning, was something she had been desperately hungry for without knowing it. She was sitting on the porch steps after supper, watching the last light leave the sky in shades of orange and rose and deep purple that she could not have described adequately to someone who had never stood on the Kansas plains and seen it for themselves, when Nelson came out and sat on the step beside her. Not too close, just beside her. They sat in silence for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had been earned. "Your week is up in 2 days," Nelson said eventually. "I know," Edith said. "Where are you planning to go?" She had been hoping he would not ask, because the honest answer was that she had no idea. She looked at her hands in her lap. "West," she said. "There are towns. Someone always needs a housekeeper or a cook or a seamstress." "You could stay," Nelson said. She looked at him. He was looking at the sunset. "Mrs. Greer is getting older," he said carefully, as though constructing the offer one measured word at a time. "She does more than she should, and she won't admit it. The ranch could use another pair of hands. I could pay a fair wage. The room's already yours." Edith searched his profile for something, she was not sure what. Some sign of what he meant by it, what he wanted from it. But his face was honest and serious, and there was nothing in it that made her feel unsafe. "Take the month," he said. "See how it sits. You can still leave if you want to at the end of it." She should have said no. She had very good reasons to say no. She was a widow with no money and no standing and no future that she could yet imagine, and accepting the extended hospitality of a single man was not without its social hazards, regardless of how proper the arrangement might be. She knew what people would say, but she was so tired of letting what people would say determine what she could and could not survive. "All right," she said, "the month." Nelson nodded, as though this too were settled, and they watched the last light die out of the sky together in a silence that had changed subtly and irrevocably in the moment between the question and the answer. The month began. Edith settled into the work of the ranch with a thoroughness that surprised everyone, including herself. She was not merely helping Mrs. Greer in the kitchen, though she did that too, and the meals at the S improved measurably in a way that the ranch hands noticed and appreciated with various degrees of eloquence. She was in the garden each morning, and she learned from Mrs. Greer which jars needed putting up and how, and she mended the curtains in the front room that had been needing attention for some time, and made a start on a loose board on the porch steps that she had been meaning to mention. Nelson found her with a hammer and nails on the 7th morning of her month and stood watching her for a moment. "You hammer like you mean it," he said. "My father was a carpenter in Ohio," she said, without looking up from the nail she was setting. "He believed daughters should be useful." "Smart man." "He was," she agreed. "He died before Gerald and I married. I've sometimes thought that was the luckiest thing that ever happened to him." It was more than she had meant to say. She felt the words land in the air between them and wished she could take them back, or at least the implication of them, because she had not yet talked to anyone on this ranch about Gerald Ford, and she had no particular desire to start. But Nelson crouched down beside her and picked up a second nail and said simply, "Want help with the far end?" And because he did not press her, because he simply accepted what she had offered and moved past the part she had not offered, she felt something ease in her chest that had been wound tight for a very long time. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They fixed the porch steps together in a companionable quiet, and when they were done Nelson tested each board with his boot and said, "Good work," in the same tone he would have used with one of his hands, which was exactly the right tone, not condescending, not surprise, just honest assessment. "You as well," Edith said. He almost smiled. She was beginning to learn his almost smiles, the way one corner of his mouth would shift just slightly before the rest of his face could commit to it. She was also beginning to understand, in the way you come to understand things when you share a roof with someone and pay attention, that Nelson Sheridan was a man of extraordinary self-containment. Not coldness, she had seen enough cold men to know the difference. This was something else. He had simply learned at some point in his solitary building of this life to hold himself in, to give what he had carefully and only when he was certain it was warranted. She had seen him with his horses, and that had told her everything she needed to know about him, really. He had a gray mare named Pepper that he was the only one who could ride, not because he was the only one strong enough to control her, but because Pepper trusted only him. Edith had watched him spend 40 minutes one afternoon just standing in the corral with the mare, not touching her, just being present, until Pepper came to him on her own terms. It was the most patient thing she had ever seen a man do. She started asking him questions in the evenings, when the day's work was done, and they would sometimes find themselves on the porch again, or inside by the stove when the nights grew colder as October deepened toward November. She asked about the ranch and about Kansas and about the cattle business, and he answered fully and without posturing, and somewhere in those conversations, he started asking her questions too about Ohio and about her father's carpentry, and about what she had studied when she had briefly attended the ladies' school in Columbus before her family's money had run out and she had been required to be practical instead. She did not talk about Gerald. Not yet. Nelson did not ask. He did tell her about himself, though in pieces and over evenings, the way a careful man shares things, not all at once but in increments, testing the ground as he goes. She learned that he had come to Kansas in 1866, that he had spent 2 years trail driving cattle north, before he saved enough to buy the first 40 acres of the S. She learned that he had been in the war, on the Union side, and had been 17 at the end of it, and that he did not talk about the war in detail, but that it had left its marks on him in ways he had found means of living with. She learned that he had once, 8 years ago, been engaged to a woman named Clara who had gone back east the winter of 1871, because she had decided the frontier was not where she wanted to be, and that he had understood it and had not blamed her, which said something about him that Edith found herself thinking about more than she expected to. She asked him once, carefully, on an evening in the 3rd week of her month, whether he had ever thought about following Clara east. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with that low, endless sound that Edith had begun to find beautiful rather than lonely. "No," he said, "this is where I belong. I knew it when I built the barn and I know it still." "You don't wish for more?" she asked. "More ease, more civilization, as people call it." "I have what I need," he said, and looked at her for a moment with those eyes that changed color with the light. "Or I did." The last 2 words fell between them like stones into still water, and Edith felt the ripples move through her in ways she was not ready to examine. She looked away at the darkness beyond the porch and she said nothing because she did not know what to say, and the silence that followed was different from the silences they had shared before. It was charged, aware. Nelson cleared his throat. "It's getting cold," he said. "You should get in." "Yes," she agreed, and went inside and lay awake for a very long time. She talked to Mrs. Greer the following morning. Not about Nelson, not exactly, but about herself, about Gerald and the debts and the men who had come looking for payment, about how she had left Wichita with $4.30 and the barely formed idea of moving far enough away that Gerald's mistakes could not reach her. Mrs. Greer listened to all of it without interruption, her hands busy with a pie crust, her face attentive and unsurprised. When Edith finished, Mrs. Greer said, "Men like Gerald Ford are not uncommon. That's not a comfort, I know. But you're here now, and here is better than where you were." "I'm aware that I cannot stay indefinitely," Edith said. "The month was a kindness. I don't mean to take advantage of it." Mrs. Greer looked at her with an expression that was almost amused. "Mrs. Ford," she said, "do you know how long I have worked for Nelson Sheridan?" 15 years. 15 years, Mrs. Greer agreed. "And in those 15 years I have seen him have not one single woman to supper, not invite one single person to stay, not once look at the spare room and think about who might be in it. He is a solitary man by nature and by habit. He does not act without reason." She pressed the pie crust into the pan with precise, practiced hands. "Consider that when you're calculating your welcome." Edith considered it. On a Thursday in the middle of her 4th week, which was supposed to be her last week, but neither of them had mentioned the end of the month in some days, Nelson rode in from the north pasture at mid-morning instead of midday, which was unusual enough that Edith looked up from the garden with a small jolt of worry. He dismounted and tied his horse and came toward her, and she could see from his face that something had happened. "There's a man in town," he said, "asking about you." The cold went through her again, fast and thorough. "Asking what about me?" she said. "Asking where you went. Described you well enough that Pete Holly's at the feed store put it together and rode out to tell me." Nelson's voice was even, but his jaw was set in a way she had not seen before. "He says his name is Coulter. Says Gerald Ford owed him $400. Edith closed her eyes for 1 second. She had known. She had known she could not outrun it forever, but she had hoped for more time. She opened her eyes and looked at Nelson and said, "Gerald borrowed from men who do not accept widows' sympathy as repayment." "I gathered that," Nelson said. "Tell me about Coulter," she told him. All of it, how Gerald had borrowed from men on the edges of legitimate business, how Coulter was one of the worst of them, how she had been told in no uncertain terms in Wichita that she was responsible for the debt by association, that a wife's hands were a husband's hands in the eyes of men like Coulter, regardless of what the law in Kansas said otherwise. Nelson listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not minimize. When she finished, he said, "The law in Kansas is actually clear that a wife does not inherit a husband's private debts. Coulter knows that. He's banking on you not knowing it, or not having anyone to stand between you and the pressure of it." Edith looked at him. "Do you know the law well?" "Well enough," he said. "I had need to learn it when I was setting this place up. And the county sheriff is a man named Abner Walsh who I've known for 12 years. He's honest, which in 1879 Kansas is rarer than it should be, but Walsh is the real article." "What are you suggesting?" Edith asked carefully. Nelson looked at her with that direct regard that she had come to realize was simply how he saw things, straight on, without flinching. "I'm suggesting we ride to town, speak to Walsh, and make clear that Coulter has no legal claim on you, and that attempting to press one through intimidation is something the county sheriff would take an interest in." Edith had not had someone stand between her and a problem in a long time. Gerald had created problems, never solved them. The sensation of Nelson offering this so matter-of-factly, with such complete absence of drama or expectation of gratitude, was so foreign to her experience that she had to take a breath before she could respond. "You don't have to do that," she said. "This is not your trouble." "No," he agreed. "But you're under my roof, and I would consider it a personal discourtesy to allow someone to frighten a woman who is under my roof." "Not my woman," she noted, "just a woman under my roof." He was being careful. He was always careful. "All right," she said. "When?" "Now, if you're willing." They rode into Caldwell together on a gray November morning, Edith on a steady chestnut mare called Dolly that Mrs. Greer assured her was the most reliable horse on the ranch. The town was busy at mid-morning with the usual commerce of a cattle trail town, wagons and riders and women doing shopping, and the perpetual sound of hammering from somewhere as the town continued to grow. As all these prairie towns were growing in 1879, reaching out into the future with timber frames and ambition. Sheriff Abner Walsh was a broad, weathered man in his 50s who shook Nelson's hand with genuine warmth and looked at Edith with a measuring kindness. He listened to the situation in full, asked several precise questions, and then leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who has heard this particular story in several variations before. "Coulter's in town, yes," he said. "I've already had my eye on him. He's done this kind of thing before, follows a widow west and leans on her. Legally, he has nothing. Morally, Walsh's expression conveyed his opinion of Coulter's morality. Mrs. Ford, I can have a conversation with Mr. Coulter that will make it clear the county sheriff has taken an interest in his activities. Men like that rely on the belief that there's no law close enough to matter. I'm close enough." Edith exhaled. "Would that be sufficient?" "For a man like Coulter, yes," Walsh said. "He'll move on to easier prospects. They always do. He was as good as his word." By the time Nelson and Edith rode back to the Double S that afternoon, Walsh had apparently already had his conversation. because a man riding in from town as they rode out told Nelson that he had seen a fellow matching Coulter's description loading his saddlebags at the livery, with the expression of someone in a considerable hurry to be somewhere else. Edith rode the 4 miles back to the ranch in a silence that had a different quality from all the silences that had come before. This one had space in it. Actual space for the first time in months. The terrible compressed fear of being pursued, of being held accountable for a dead man's recklessness, had loosened its grip, and what was left in its place was a lightness that she had forgotten was possible. She stopped her horse at the gate to the ranch and looked at Nelson. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "You're all right." Yes." She paused. "I think I am." He nodded once slowly, and then he said something she had not expected. "You were very brave today." "I was terrified," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "That's when it counts." They rode in through the gate, and Edith thought that she had never in her life wanted so badly to simply stay somewhere. That evening she went looking for Mrs. Greer and found her in the sitting room doing needlework, and she sat down across from her and said, "I think the month is nearly up." Mrs. Greer did not look up from her work. "It is," she agreed. "I don't know what comes next," Edith said. "I don't mean to be a burden. I know I've been earning my keep, but—" "Mrs. Ford," Mrs. Greer said, and looked up then with those sharp, warm eyes. "When are you going to let yourself want something?" Edith was quiet. "I have watched you for a month, Mrs. Greer continued, setting her needlework in her lap. "I have watched you make yourself useful and make yourself small and make yourself careful and make yourself everything except honest about what you want. And I say this with great affection and complete respect. It is beginning to be tiresome." Edith stared at her, and then, to her own considerable surprise, she laughed. It came out of her fully formed and real, and it sounded strange in her own ears because she had not heard it in so long. "What do you suggest I do about it?" she asked when the laugh had settled. "I suggest," Mrs. Greer said, picking up her needlework again with great dignity, "that you go find Nelson, who is in the barn doing something entirely unnecessary at this hour of the evening because he doesn't know what to do with himself when he has something to say and doesn't know how to say it, and you let the conversation go where it goes." Edith stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She took a breath. "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Greer," she said. "Yes," Mrs. Greer agreed pleasantly. "Now go." The barn was warm with the smell of hay and horses, and the particular peace that large animals lend to enclosed spaces. Nelson was at the far end, running a brush over Pepper's coat with slow, even strokes, and the gray mare's eyes were half closed in contentment. He looked up when Edith came in, and he stilled. She walked toward him through the lantern-lit dark. "The month is up in 3 days," she said. "I know. I've been thinking about what comes after." "So have I," he said. She reached the mare's stall and stopped, and Pepper turned her great head to look at Edith with the calm interest of an animal that has decided she is not a threat. "I was going to leave," Edith said. "I had myself convinced that leaving was the only reasonable thing, that I had no right to want." She stopped. "What?" Nelson said quietly. She met his eyes. In the lantern light they were amber, warm, steady. "This," she said, "all of it. The ranch and the work and the evenings on the porch," and she paused. "And you." The word hung in the warm lantern air. Nelson set down the brush very carefully on the rail of the stall. He turned to face her fully, and he looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Something open, something that he had been holding back for weeks, something she recognized because she had been holding the same thing back herself. "I have been trying," he said, "to be respectful of what you've been through. You lost a husband. You came here under duress. I didn't want to be another man making demands of you when you'd just gotten free of the last one." "You are nothing like the last one," Edith said. "I know," he said. "I know I'm not, but I wanted you to know it. I wanted you to have the time to see it clearly without me pushing it." "I've seen it," she said. "I've seen it for a long time." He took a step toward her. She did not step back. He raised one hand and touched her face with the backs of his fingers, that careful, measured gesture of someone who has learned to be gentle with things he values. And she leaned into it just slightly. the way Pepper had leaned toward him in the corral. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as a housekeeper, not as a paid hand. I would like you to stay as I want to court you properly, Edith, if you're willing. I want—" "Yes," she said. "I am willing." He looked at her. The almost smile came fully to the surface for the first time, and it transformed his face in a way that made her breath catch, not the careful, guarded man she had first seen in the rain, but something warmer and more open, something that had apparently been there all along waiting for the right moment to come out. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, gently, a beginning rather than a declaration, and she closed her eyes and let herself feel it. "Good," he said against her hair. The weeks that followed were the sweetest Edith had ever known, which was a thing she could not have imagined in the rain outside that general store with $4 in her pocket and terror in her bones. The days on the Double S had a different texture now, the same work, the same rhythms, but illuminated by the fact that they both knew what was between them, even as they were careful and proper about it in the way the times required. He brought her things. Not grand things. A wildflower he had found near the east fence line, dried autumn orange and pressed between his broad fingers with improbable delicacy. A book he had found at the general store, knowing she read and that she had exhausted his small shelf. A length of blue ribbon that he placed on the kitchen table one morning without explanation and disappeared before she could respond, which was how she knew it had cost him something to do even that small a thing. She brought him things too. She made the particular pie his mother had apparently been known for. He had mentioned it once in passing, and she had asked Mrs. Greer for the recipe, which Mrs. Greer had given with the careful, solemn air of someone passing on a sacred text. When Nelson took the first bite of it at supper one evening, he stopped. He set down his fork and looked at her across the table. "Where did you get that recipe?" he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before. "Mrs. Greer," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother made that pie," he said, "every birthday. I haven't tasted it in 15 years. "I know," Edith said softly. "I thought you might want it back." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not almost a smile. It was something deeper, something that went past smiling into gratitude and tenderness, and the particular emotion that has no easy name, that exists in the space between caring about someone and loving them. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. December settled over the Kansas prairie with a seriousness that Edith had not yet experienced, the cold coming in from the north with authority and turning the sky the color of iron. The cattle were moved to the winter pastures, and the ranch hand's days shifted to the particular work of keeping animals alive in cold weather, which was its own demanding science. The house grew more central, more fires, more time in the evenings by the stove, more conversation in the lantern light. Nelson started telling her things he had not told anyone. She could feel it, the careful man opening doors that had been shut for years. He told her about the war, a little, the specific details left out but the shape of it given. He told her about the years before the ranch was profitable, when he had lived on very little and worked himself to the edge of what a body could endure because he could not afford to stop. He told her about the loneliness of those years, which surprised her because she had not thought he would use that word about himself. But he said it plainly, without self-pity. There were winters when this house was very empty. She told him in return about Ohio and her father, and the carpentry shop that had smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular contentment of a childhood that was not wealthy but was safe. She told him about her mother, who had died when Edith was 14, and whose absence had shaped everything that came after, including Gerald, she supposed, because a girl who loses her mother at 14 becomes vulnerable to anyone who offers to take care of her, even when the offer is imprecise and ultimately empty. She told him about Gerald honestly. She felt she owed him that. She described not a monster but a weak man, charming and irresponsible and ultimately too small for the life he pretended to live, borrowing money he could not repay and borrowing it again to cover the first debt and so on until the whole thing collapsed. He was not cruel, she said. He was not kind either. He was simply absent, even when he was present. And I was lonely in a way that took me years to identify because I had thought loneliness was what happened when you were alone, not what happened when you were married. Nelson was quiet for a long moment after she said this. That's the worst kind, he said finally. The loneliness you can't point to. Yes, she said. He reached across the small space between them on the settee and took her hand. Just that held it carefully, as though it were something he wanted to be sure of. She turned her hand palm up and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that by the stove while the wind pushed at the house from outside, and it was the most entirely right she had felt in longer than she could remember. In the second week of December, a letter arrived that changed the shape of things. It came from Ohio, from a cousin of Edith's named Marion, who had heard through some chain of family correspondence that Edith had been widowed and had written to offer the spare room in her Columbus house if Edith wished to come east. It was a kind letter, genuinely kind, and Edith read it twice and felt the pull of it, the familiar, the known, the safety of blood relation. She brought it to Nelson that evening. She handed it to him and let him read it, which was itself a statement about what had grown between them. He read it carefully and handed it back without expression. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to know what you think," she said. "I think it's a kind offer," he said. "I think your cousin sounds like a decent woman," and I think he stopped. Then, "I think you should know before you make any decision that I intend to ask you to marry me. I haven't done it yet because I am doing this properly and I thought you needed to settle into yourself before I said it. But since there's now another option on the table, it seems right to put both options on the table." Edith stared at him. He was looking at her with the direct, steady regard of a man who has made up his mind and is prepared for whatever comes next. "Nelson," she said. "I know," he said. "It's fast, by certain standards. But I have been alive for 33 years and I have been alone for most of them, and I know what I want when I see it. You walked into my kitchen and made bread before 6 in the morning and fixed the porch steps with a hammer like you meant it, and you remembered a pie recipe to give me back something I'd lost, and he paused. I am in love with you, Edith. I've known it for some time. And I think you know that staying here and going to Columbus are actually very different things, and I wanted you to have the full information when you chose." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire shifted in the stove. Somewhere outside a horse moved in the barn. She thought about Columbus and the spare room and the comfort of the familiar. And she thought about 4 months ago standing in the rain with terror in her bones. And she thought about the corral and Pepper coming to him on her own terms. And the pie and the ribbon and his hand holding hers by the stove. And the way he had said Coulter has no legal claim on you with such absolute certainty. And the way the evenings on this porch had felt like coming home, even before she had admitted to herself that home was what she was looking for. "I'm not going to Columbus," she said. Something moved through his face, relief and warmth, and something so private she felt she was seeing something she should treasure carefully. "Then I should ask you properly," he said. He stood up from the settee, and he went down on one knee in front of her with the unself-conscious seriousness of a man who does everything fully when he has decided to do it. "Edith Ford, I am asking you to be my wife, to share this ranch and this life and whatever comes of it, good or hard or somewhere between. I am asking you to stay." She reached forward and took his face between her hands. "I'll stay," she said. "Yes, of course I'll stay." He stood and pulled her to her feet, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful pressure of his lips against her forehead in the barn. This was open and warm and real, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding carefully for months, and it was exactly right. Mrs. Greer, who was definitely not standing in the hallway listening, made a sound that was either a cough or a very small sob of satisfaction, and then her footsteps retreated toward the kitchen with considerable dignity. They were married in January 1880, in the church in Caldwell that had been built only 2 years before and still smelled of fresh timber. It was a small ceremony because Edith had no family who could make the journey in time, and Nelson's family was gone. But the church was not empty. The ranch hands came, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good shirts, and Mrs. Greer sat in the front pew in her best dress with an expression of profound self-congratulation, and Sheriff Walsh attended as a representative of general goodwill. And various neighbors and townsfolk who had taken an interest in the affair filled the pews with enough warmth to make the January cold irrelevant. Edith wore the blue dress she had brought west in her carpetbag, the only good dress she owned, and she had pinned the blue ribbon Nelson had left on the kitchen table into her hair. Nelson stood at the front of the church in a dark jacket that he had clearly pressed specifically for the occasion, and when she walked up the aisle toward him, he looked at her the way she had begun to understand he would always look at her when she caught him off guard, with that unguarded warmth that was more eloquent than anything he said. He took her hand when she reached him. "Edith," he said quietly. "Nelson," she said. The minister, a young man named Prescott who was earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the romance of the situation, managed the ceremony without dropping anything, and when he pronounced them husband and wife and Nelson kissed her with his hands on either side of her face in complete indifference to their audience, Mrs. Greer definitely made a sound that was not a cough. The celebration afterward was at the ranch, because it was the only building large enough, and Mrs. Greer had been cooking for 3 days in preparation, and the table was laden with more food than any reasonable group of people could eat, which everyone attempted to disprove enthusiastically. There was music from a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands, a quiet young man named Tom who turned out to have a talent he had been hiding under his hat, and the front room was cleared for dancing, and Nelson danced with Edith with the slightly careful footwork of a man who knows the steps but does not deploy them often. "I didn't know you could dance," she said. "My mother insisted," he said. "She said a man who couldn't dance was only half finished." "Smart woman," Edith said. She was very close to him. The fiddle was sweet. Outside, the January wind did what it would, and inside it was warm and full of light and people who wished them well. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly near her ear. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "Nelson," she said, "I arrived in this town 4 months ago in a rainstorm with $4.30 and the conviction that I was entirely out of luck. And now I am your wife. Yes, I am happier than I have language for." His almost smile came all the way up, broad and real, and she had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. The spring of 1880 came in slowly over the Kansas prairie, creeping back from the edges of the land with green that started at the south fence and worked north over the course of weeks. Edith learned the ranch in the way you learn a place you have claimed, not the surface of it, which she had known by March, but the deep structure of it, the way the light moved across it at different hours, the particular mood of it in wind and calm, the sounds it made at night that were different from any other place she had ever been. She and Nelson had established a life together that had a grain and a texture that felt to both of them, in their different ways, like a thing they had been moving toward for years even before they knew the other existed. They were not people who used many words for what they felt between them, because they were not that kind of people, but the feeling was present in everything they did, in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, and the way they talked through the decisions of the ranch in the evenings, and the way he would put his hand on the small of her back when he passed her, and the way she would bring him coffee without being asked, and know exactly how he took it. She wrote a letter to her cousin Marion in Columbus, explaining that she had found what she was looking for in Kansas. Marion wrote back that she was glad, and also that she had always thought Edith was more capable than Gerald Ford had ever allowed her to appear, which made Edith sit still for a moment with the letter in her hands and feel the specific bittersweet satisfaction of being known. In early April, Nelson bought 10 more acres to the north from a family named Holbrook who were moving on to Colorado, which extended the Double S to a size that required adding another ranch hand. The man he hired was named James Alcott, a black man who had come up through Texas with the cattle drives and was one of the finest horsemen Nelson had ever seen. In 1880 Kansas, a black man working a white man's ranch was not without its complications. There were men in Caldwell who had opinions about the arrangement, and some of those opinions were expressed with more aggression than others. Nelson dealt with these expressions with quiet finality and absolute consistency, and Edith backed him in this without reservation. "You do what's right," she told him one evening, after a particularly unpleasant encounter with a neighbor named Stokes who had come by the ranch with unsolicited opinions. "And then you do it again. And eventually the people with the wrong opinions have to decide whether they want to keep their opinions or keep their relationship with you." "Stokes won't come around," Nelson said. "Then he won't," Edith said. "He can stay home and keep his opinions company." Nelson looked at her with that warm regard that still caught her off guard sometimes. "You are remarkably direct," he said. "I grew up with a carpenter who said a straight line was more honest than a crooked one," she said. "It stuck with me." James Alcott turned out to be everything Nelson had assessed, a superb horseman and a hard worker, and as they all discovered over the months, a man of considerable quiet humor that emerged gradually as he determined that this was a household where it would be received. He and Tom, the fiddle-playing ranch hand, became something like friends, which was the kind of small, unremarkable social miracle that the West occasionally allowed in ways that the East, with its more entrenched hierarchies, often did not. By June of 1880, Edith understood that she was expecting a child. She told Nelson on a warm evening when the prairie was at its best, the grass moving in long gold waves under a sky that went on forever. They were sitting on the porch, their porch. It was their porch now. It had always felt that way, and she turned to him and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. "We're going to have a child," she said. "In December, I think, if my arithmetic is right." His face did something she had only glimpsed before in fragments and had never seen whole. It opened completely. Every careful reservation, every considered restraint, every measured response he had cultivated through years of solitary life, all of it gave way at once to something that was simple and enormous and entirely unguarded. "Edith," he said, and his voice was different, roughened and low. "I know," she said, and she reached for his hand. He held her hand in both of his. He looked out at the prairie for a long moment with an expression that she understood was him absorbing something too large for quick words, and then he looked back at her and said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "I'm very well," she said, "and a little frightened, and very glad." "I'll be here," he said, "every day. Whatever you need." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm glad." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the warmth of it moved through her from the inside out. Mrs. Greer received the news with an expression that suggested she had known for a week already and had been waiting politely. "Good," she said, with great satisfaction, and went to adjust something on the stove that probably did not need adjusting. The summer of 1880 on the Double S was the fullest Edith had ever known. The pregnancy progressed well, which was a mercy in a time and place where the alternative was always a present possibility, and Dr. Hammond in Caldwell was a capable and matter-of-fact man who saw her regularly and pronounced everything proceeding normally. She continued to do the work she had always done on the ranch, modified as the months progressed, and her body required different things from her, and Nelson watched her with a vigilance that was careful rather than suffocating. He did not try to put her in a chair and keep her there, which she would have found intolerable, but she noticed that heavy things were quietly attended to before she could reach them, and that someone always seemed to be nearby in a way that was both useful and unobtrusive. She taught herself embroidery that summer from a manual she ordered through the general store, which was not a thing she had ever had the patience for before, but which turned out to be exactly the right occupation for the evenings of late pregnancy, when she wanted to be doing something with her hands but could not be pulling fence posts. The results were not beautiful by any objective measure, but they were hers, and Nelson framed the first finished piece, an imperfect but earnest rendering of the Double S brand, and hung it in the front room, which made her laugh. "You did not have to hang it," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." The fall was busy with the particular work of a ranch preparing for winter, and Edith found herself in the interesting position of knowing enough about the operation to have useful opinions about it, which Nelson solicited and weighted genuinely. They were good together in that way. Their minds worked differently enough to catch each other's errors, and similarly enough to agree on fundamentals, and the combination of his experience and her organizational clear-sightedness made the ranch run with a smoothness that all the hands noticed without necessarily articulating. Their son was born on the 4th of December 1880. It was a long night, which Dr. Hammond attended along with Mrs. Greer, who had been at more births than the doctor, and whose presence in the room was essential in ways that transcended medicine. Nelson was not allowed in the room, which was the custom of the time, and which he obeyed with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything. But Edith was later told that he sat in the kitchen the entire night without moving, and that Tom and James had sat up with him without being asked, which she found so deeply right about everyone involved that it made her cry, though that might also have been the general state of things. When Mrs. Greer came to the kitchen door at 5 in the morning and said, "A boy." "Both well," Nelson stood up from his chair and walked to the door and had to put one hand on the frame for a moment. "Both well," he repeated. "Both entirely well," Mrs. Greer confirmed, with the gentle firmness of a woman who understands the weight of those words. "You can come in now." Edith was exhausted in a way that she could not have previously imagined, and also more awake than she had ever been in her life. She was sitting up in their bed with a small bundle in her arms, and when Nelson came through the door and she saw his face, she thought that no painting or poem had ever come close to capturing what it looked like when a man who had been alone for too long first understood that he was not alone anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed. She moved the bundle toward him. He took the baby with the same care he gave to everything he valued, both hands, full attention, the particular gentleness that was native to him. "Hello," he said very quietly to the baby, and then looking at Edith, I know," she said. "What do you want to call him?" Nelson asked. She had been thinking about this for months. "I'd like to call him William," she said, "after my father." Nelson looked at the baby for a long moment. "William Sheridan," he said, as though weighing it. Then, "William, hello, William." William Sheridan opened his eyes, which were the unfocused dark blue of a newborn, and registered the world with a vague and complete trust, and Nelson held him like something extraordinary had been placed in his keeping, which it had. The winter of 1880 into 1881 passed with the particular quality that a first baby gives a household: the altered rhythms, the renegotiated sleep, the steady, astonishing fact of a new person growing larger and more present in the world day by day. Nelson, who had spent years in solitary self-sufficiency, adapted to fatherhood with a thoroughness that Edith watched with continuous wonder. He was not the kind of father who handed the child to his wife and returned to his own business. He was present, attentive, learning William's sounds and moods and needs with the same patient attention he had given to everything that mattered to him. She would find him standing over the cradle in the early morning, not doing anything, just watching the baby breathe, with an expression on his face that she recognized as the specific piece of someone who has found the thing they did not know they were looking for. She said once, in those quiet winter months, "You're going to be a remarkable father." He looked up from William's cradle. "I'm trying to be adequate," he said. "You're past adequate," she said. "You have been for some time." He said nothing to that, but the warmth that moved through his face was his answer. Spring came back to the Double S with the insistence of things that do not ask permission, and William Sheridan was 5 months old and growing into a strong, observant baby who had his mother's chin and his father's eyes, and apparently the undivided personal devotion of every adult on the ranch, including Tom, who had taken to playing fiddle in the evenings with William on his lap, which produced in the baby an expression of profound contentment. Mrs. Greer, who had watched William take his first uncertain supported steps on the kitchen floor with her arms crossed and her eyes very bright, announced in March of 1881 that she intended to cut her hours, which she described as retirement rather than departure. She would keep her room, Nelson had insisted on this, absolutely, and she would help as she liked and rest when she liked, and Edith would take on the management of the household fully, which was only truthful because she had been managing it in practice for some time. "You built this into something," Mrs. Greer told Edith one afternoon on the porch, watching William investigate a sunbeam that had appeared on the boards with the focused determination of someone conducting very important research. "You know that. We built it," Edith said. "You and Nelson did," Mrs. Greer agreed. "And I'd say you both needed it equally, which is the best reason for building anything." Edith looked at the ranch around her, the whitewashed timber and the barns and the horses in the corral, and the garden coming back up green at the edges of the yard, and the enormous sky that went forever. And she thought about a rainstorm and a man in a canvas duster, and the words however long you need. "I came here frightened," she said. "You did," Mrs. Greer said. "I haven't been frightened in a long time." Mrs. Greer smiled, which she did not often do in a way that was visible, and which when it appeared transformed her face entirely. "Good," she said. "That's exactly as it should be." The summer of 1881 was the finest the Kansas plains had offered in years, warm enough for the crops and mild enough for the cattle and long evenings that lingered like they were reluctant to become night. Edith found herself in a life so full and so layered that she sometimes stopped in the middle of a task just to acknowledge it, the way you stop in the middle of a beautiful passage of music to let it reach you properly. She and Nelson had found their particular language. Not just words, but the whole vocabulary of a life made together. The look that meant he was thinking something he was not yet ready to say. The gesture she made when she was pleased with something but did not want to make a production of it. The shorthand of two people who have paid attention to each other long enough to read the information underneath the words. They argued occasionally, because they were both capable people with opinions and the ranch presented genuine disagreements about method and priority, and their arguments had the particular quality of arguments between people who respect each other direct, sometimes heated, always resolved, and never leaving damage behind. He would admit when she was right, which she valued more than she could say. She would change her mind when the evidence warranted it, which he valued equally. One evening in August, Edith sitting on the porch steps with William on her lap pointing out the stars in the order Nelson had taught him and Nelson leaning against the porch rail with his coffee, he said, "I keep thinking about the north fence line. The Hallbrook acreage," she said, "the eastern edge of it. There's good water there, a spring. I've been thinking about a second corral." She shifted William on her lap. "Show me tomorrow," she said. "I want to walk it." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You want to walk a fence line. I want to see the spring," she said, "and I want to know what you're thinking about before I have to hear it third hand from James." He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, the kind that had taken months to emerge and now appeared regularly enough to be one of the things she looked forward to most. William looked up at the sound of it with an expression of great delight because his father laughing was still, at 15 months, one of his favorite phenomena. "Tomorrow," Nelson agreed. They walked the fence line the next morning, all three of them, William on Nelson's shoulders for the parts where the grass was tall, and the spring was exactly as Nelson had described, clear and cold and good, tucked against a rise that sheltered it from the north wind, with a flat area adjacent that was indeed well suited to expansion. Nelson stood at the edge of it with his hands on his hips and the expression he got when he was planning something, which was very focused and very still. "What do you think?" he asked Edith. She looked at the ground and the water and the rise. "I think you're right," she said, "and I think if you put the corral here you'll have good drainage and the windbreak from the rise, which will matter in winter. That's what I was thinking." "When do you want to start?" "September," he said, "before the hard cold." "Then let's start in September," she said. He looked at her across the spring with that direct amber regard and said, "I love you, Edith." He said it sometimes, cleanly and without prelude, just when it was true and needed saying, which was the best possible way for it to be said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." William, who was sitting on the ground examining a beetle with scientific intensity, did not look up. The second corral was built in September 1881, with Nelson and James and Tom doing the posts and Edith doing the accounts and William underfoot in the way that toddlers are underfoot, which is both maddening and irreplaceable. By October it was done and the horses were in it, and Nelson stood at the fence one evening looking at what had been built and said, with great simplicity, "Good." Edith stood beside him. She had William by the hand. The evening was cold but not yet bitter, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the last light. "Are you happy?" she asked him, which was what he had asked her on their wedding night. He looked at her. He looked at William. He looked at the ranch and the sky and the new corral and all the visible evidence of years of work and decision. And then he looked back at her and said, with the absolute plain directness of a man who has learned that the honest answer is always the best one, "I am the happiest man in Kansas." She smiled. It was the smile that came from somewhere deep and unguarded, the one she had not had in the years of her first marriage, the one that appeared only here, only now, only in this life. "That's very specific," she said. "I like to be accurate," he said, and took her free hand, and they stood at the fence until the last light was gone and William started insisting on supper. In the spring of 1882, they learned there would be a second child. Edith told Nelson on the porch on an April morning when the prairie was just finding its green again, and he reached over and pulled her into his arms and held her there for a long moment without speaking, which was his particular way of expressing the things that were too large for words. "William will be pleased," she said, into his shoulder. "William will be extremely possessive and then gradually adjust," Nelson said, and she felt his chest move with the laugh beneath her ear. "Like his father," she said. "I am not possessive," he said. "You are," she said with great affection. "You are exactly that. You hold everything you love with both hands." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, is that bad?" She pulled back to look at him. "It is one of my favorite things about you," she said. November of 1882 brought a daughter. They named her Rose Catherine Sheridan Rose because Edith had always loved them and Catherine for Nelson's mother, which made Nelson go very quiet for a moment when she suggested it, and then nod once, decisively, in the way that meant he had been moved but was containing it. William, now almost 2, inspected his sister with the guarded interest of someone who has been told about a thing, but is reserving judgment on whether it meets expectations. He eventually placed one small, careful hand on Rose's head in a gesture that misses. Greer, who was watching from the doorway of the kitchen, identified as the beginning of brotherly devotion. She was right about this, as she was right about most things. The winter of 1882 was cold but kind in the ways that mattered. No illness came to the Sheridan house, and the cattle came through the season without significant loss, and the horses in both corrals were well. James Alcott, who had been at the S for 2 years by then, and had become as much a part of the ranch as the timber and the land, found himself at Christmas dinner with a family that had adopted him into the center of it without announcement or ceremony, simply by accumulation of meals and trust, and the daily fact of choosing the same life side by side. He carved the beef and Nelson poured the cider, and Edith brought the food to the table and Mrs. Greer sat at the head of the table by unanimous and unspoken agreement, and William made an extremely detailed statement about something that only made partial sense to the adults and complete sense, apparently, to Rose, who watched him with her serious dark eyes and patted the table. It was exactly the right kind of Christmas. Edith sometimes thought, in the years that came after, about the woman she had been standing under that overhang in the rain with $4.30, and the particular lonely terror of having nowhere to go. She thought about her with compassion and with something like gratitude, because that woman had made the decision to accept a stranger's offer and get in the wagon, which had required more courage than it appeared. She had asked only for a week. Nelson had said take the month, and by the end of it, neither of them had spoken of leaving. It was not complicated when she considered it in those terms. It was, in fact, the simplest thing. Two people who had each been living at a remove from what they needed, finding each other in a rainstorm and having the sense to pay attention. She said something like this to Nelson one evening in the summer of 1884, when William was 3.5 and Rose was almost 2, and the ranch was the busiest and most prosperous it had ever been, and they were sitting on the porch in the gold evening light while the children played in the yard under Mrs. Greer's supervision. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "The night I arrived." "Often," he said. "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was considering it properly rather than reaching for the quickest answer. "I think I was paying attention," he said. "I think that's all it was. There were 100 men who walked past you in that rain and didn't think twice. I happened to look across the street and see someone who needed help, and I had the help to give, and I gave it. That's all." "That's all," she repeated. "The rest followed," he said, "as things do when you start with something honest." Edith looked at him. This man who had walked across a muddy street in a rainstorm to offer a stranger shelter, who had said take the month with such uncomplicated generosity, who had built a barn at 19 and a life afterward, and a family now that filled the house with the sound she had not known she had been missing until they arrived. This careful, patient, direct, and decent man who had held her like something extraordinary and who had never once in all the years since given her reason to be anything but certain of him. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," she said. "I want you to know that clearly and without qualification." He looked at her with those amber, creek-water eyes and said, "I know, so are you." Below them in the yard, William was showing Rose the specific and complicated method by which one catches a grasshopper, which involved a great deal of sneaking and not very much success. Mrs. Greer was watching them from her chair with the expression of someone attending the finest entertainment available. James and Tom were laughing about something near the barn. The sound of it carried over on the warm evening air. The horses moved in the corrals. The prairie spread out to every horizon in every direction, enormous and golden and ongoing, as it had been before any of them arrived and would be long after, patient and indifferent and yet somehow, in the way that places absorb the life lived within them, entirely theirs. Edith took Nelson's hand. He held it with both of his, as he always did, and the evening settled over the double-S like a blessing, unhurried and complete. 3 years later, in the spring of 1887, there was a third child, another son, whom they named Daniel Sheridan Ford for Edith's name, the name she had carried through the hardest years of her life, and which she had decided deserved to be carried forward into something good. Nelson had suggested it, which was the kind of thing he did quietly and without fanfare that made her love him in ways she could not catalogue. Daniel was a loud and joyful baby, entirely unlike his contemplative older brother and his serious older sister, and he came into the world announcing his presence at considerable volume, and proceeded to maintain this general stance on life with great consistency. William, who was 6 and had recently decided he wanted to be a horseman like James when he grew old enough, received his new brother with a kind of resigned acceptance. Rose, who was 4 and extremely opinionated, took one look at Daniel and announced that she would be teaching him things, which she immediately began to do. Nelson held his second son and looked at Edith over Daniel's very pink and indignant head with an expression that had not changed in 8 years, that same open, unguarded warmth that she had first seen in the barn on the evening when everything between them shifted. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "The house is full," he said. "The house," she said, "is exactly right." He smiled, the full smile, the one that had taken months to surface the first time and which now appeared with the comfortable frequency of a thing that has found its home. He looked down at Daniel, who had settled with the abrupt certainty of the very young into a deep and total sleep. "Hello, Daniel," he said softly. "Welcome." Outside, William could be heard running across the yard and Rose could be heard telling him to slow down, and Mrs. Greer could be heard from somewhere near the kitchen window telling them both to come inside, and the horses were in the corrals, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the late afternoon light, and the prairie went on forever in all directions. Edith Sheridan, who had arrived in a rainstorm with nothing but a carpetbag and $4.30, and the barely formed hope that distance might be a substitute for safety, closed her eyes and listened to her home. It was the most particular and perfect sound she had ever heard. She had asked only for a week. He had given her everything. And she had given him the same, which was what love was when it was honest. Not a subtraction, not a compromise, not the careful rationing of two people who did not trust abundance, but the full and mutual giving of two people who had each, in their different ways, been waiting for someone worth giving everything to. The Double S Ranch stood on the Kansas plains in the evening light, solid and square and real, built by a man who intended to stay, and now inhabited by a family that had been built the same way, carefully, honestly, one day at a time, with both hands. William grew up to be exactly the horseman he intended to be. Rose grew up to teach, which surprised no one who had known her at 4. Daniel grew up to be a rancher like his father and took over the eastern portion of the Double S when he was old enough, which extended it further than Nelson had imagined the year he built the first barn at 19. Mrs. Alma Greer lived to be 83 years old. She never left the Double S in her final years. She sat on the porch in a good chair that Nelson had made for her with his own hands, and watched the Sheridan grandchildren do the same things children do on open land everywhere, run and shout and fall down and get up and run again. And she was pleased with all of it. Nelson Sheridan was a man who had built everything in his life with intention. He had built the barn and then the house and then the corrals and then the reputation and then, against all his careful solitary expectations, a family that occupied every room and overflowed onto the porch and into the yard and across the land in the fullness of living. Edith Sheridan was a woman who had arrived with nothing and built everything, which was true of her first life and truer of her second, and she understood the difference. The first time she had built alone, in the shadow of a man who provided no foundation. The second time she had built with someone who laid the groundwork as carefully as she did and stood beside her in the work, genuinely beside her, every day. They grew old together on the Kansas plains, which is the simplest thing to say and the largest thing there is. On an evening in the autumn of a year much later than either of them would have predicted when they were young, they sat on the porch of the Double S in the last of the season's warmth, and the prairie spread out to every horizon in every direction, and the horses moved in the corrals, and from inside the house came the sounds of the generation below them doing the ordinary, extraordinary things of their lives, and the sky did what the Kansas sky had always done, went on and on above them. Enormous and full of light, Nelson reached across and took her hand. She held it in both of hers. "Still the happiest man in Kansas?" she asked. He looked at her with those amber eyes that had watched her across every season the prairie offered, warm and direct and entirely certain. "The happiest man," he said, "anywhere."